In a rock shelter carved into a forested hillside in southwestern Nigeria, a partial skull sat buried for 13,000 years. When archaeologists finally found it in 1965, they assumed at first that they were looking at something recent, a later Stone Age burial, a relatively modern human. They were wrong, or at least they were not entirely right. The skull looked ancient in all the ways that matter: long, low, flat across the top, a brow ridge that had no business being there in the late Pleistocene. When researchers eventually ran the numbers, the morphology placed this skull somewhere near fossils that had been extinct for at least 100,000 years. Yet the date kept coming back as 13 to 16,000 years old. Multiple independent dating methods, including uranium-series analysis, consistently pointed to a terminal Pleistocene chronology. A skull that looked 300,000 years old had apparently died in a world that already had pottery, bows, and domesticated dogs somewhere on the other side of the planet. Nobody could explain it, and for decades, nobody really tried. This is the story of Iho Eleru and the ghost that was hiding inside it all along. The site is called Iho Eleru, which translates from Yoruba as Cave of Ashes. It sits in what is now Ondo State, in the forest savanna borderland of southwestern Nigeria. In 1965, a British archaeologist named Thurston Shaw was leading excavations there when his team uncovered the partial remains of a skull buried roughly a meter below the surface, within an undisturbed later Stone Age context. Shaw and his colleagues knew almost immediately that they were looking at something unusual. The skull was identified as Homo sapiens, but was open to debate. It looked almost like a modern human skull, but wasn't quite right. It had a longer and flatter cranial shape, with a prominent brow ridge. Even accounting for individual variation, the proportions were off. The skull's long and rather low cranial shape gave it apparent archaic aspects, and multivariate analysis placed it apart from any recent African samples scientists tried to compare it to. The first radiocarbon date put it at roughly 11,000 years old, already strange. Then in 2011, researchers re-examined the skull using a more reliable technique and concluded it was at least 13,000 years old, 2,000 years older than previously thought. More recent uranium-series dating pushed that estimate slightly further to between 11,700 and 16,300 years ago. In other words, this individual had been alive during or just before the end of the last ice age, walking through a forested landscape in what is now Nigeria, with a skull that should have belonged to a hominin from the Middle Pleistocene. Iho Eleru is the only site in all of Western Africa from which Pleistocene-age hominin fossils have ever been recovered. One skull, one site, one puzzle with no obvious solution. And for a long time, scientists could only guess. There were two explanations on the table, and neither was comfortable. The first was that Iho Eleru represented a late surviving relic population, an archaic human lineage that had somehow persisted in the forests of West Africa long after its kind had disappeared everywhere else on Earth. Hidden, isolated, quietly carrying a skull shape that the rest of the world had moved on from hundreds of thousands of years earlier. It has been suggested that the paleoenvironmental setting, a humid forested habitat, might have favored ecological isolation and thus the persistence of both archaic human groups and archaic technologies. West Africa's forests are vast and ancient. They could, in theory, have sheltered a population that the rest of the human story simply never encountered. The second explanation was interbreeding, not a surviving relic but a hybrid. A modern human who had mated with something older, something archaic, and inherited enough of its skull architecture to confuse every researcher who looked at the fossil for the next 50 years. Both explanations required something that nobody had: a ghost. According to a study published in 2020, between 2 and 19% of the DNA of 4 West African populations may have come from an unknown archaic hominin that split from the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals somewhere between 360,000 and over 1 million years ago. This was not a Neanderthal. It was not a Denisovan. It had branched off from the hominid evolutionary tree more than 600,000 years ago, roughly 100,000 years before Neanderthals did. Researchers at UCLA found its fingerprints not in any fossil, but buried inside the genomes of living people, the Yoruba, the Isan, the Mende, and populations in the Gambia. These extinct relatives of Homo sapiens had passed genes to the African ancestors of modern Yoruba and Mende people starting around 124,000 years ago or later. Some of the DNA segments they passed down were not neutral. Certain inherited DNA segments influenced survival-enhancing functions, including tumor suppression and hormone regulation, and are thought to have spread rapidly among modern West Africans because they were genuinely useful. This was a species that had lived alongside modern humans in Africa, interbred with them, left its biology inside them, and then disappeared from the fossil record so completely that scientists gave it a name that is not really a name at all. They called it a ghost population. And here is where Iho Eleru stops being a local puzzle and becomes something larger, because the ghost population that left its DNA in modern West Africans needed a face. It needed a body. It needed, in the language of paleontology, a type specimen, a physical fossil that could be pointed to as the physical embodiment of this otherwise invisible lineage. In the fossil record, modern humans show up around 200,000 years ago, but in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a few fossils have been found with a mix of archaic and modern features that are only 35,000 years old. Iho Eleru, at 13 to 16,000 years, pushes that window even further. The skull's morphology is now being read in a new light. The results of the morphological study point to a similarity with late archaic African specimens dating to the late Pleistocene, and are described as being in accordance with suggestions of deep population substructure in Africa and a complex evolutionary process for the origin of modern humans. In other words, the skull doesn't have to be a freak, it doesn't have to be a disease, or a deformity, or a statistical outlier. It can be exactly what it looks like, the face of a population that was still here, still breeding, still leaving traces of itself in the living, long after everyone assumed it was gone. The question that has haunted this skull for 60 years, why does it look so old when it is so young, now has at least the shape of an answer. The ghost was real, the interbreeding happened, and 13,000 years ago, somewhere in the forest savanna corridor of what is now southwestern Nigeria, a person died and was buried in a shallow grave in a cave of ashes. That person was not quite what we would call modern. They carried, in the architecture of their bones, the signature of a lineage that had been splitting from ours for over 500,000 years. A lineage we had never managed to name, never managed to find in any undisputed fossil, never managed to fully see until we started looking not in the ground, but in the DNA of the living. Bones have been found in Africa from archaic populations, but no DNA has been recovered. Still, as researchers note, the technology is continuing to improve, and people are still out there looking for more fossils. The Cave of Ashes may yet have more to say. If this story changed how you think about who was walking the earth just a few thousand years before agriculture began, subscribe. Origins Revealed is built on exactly these stories. The ones where a single skull, sitting quietly in storage, turns out to contain a question that takes 60 years and an entire new field of science to even begin to answer.